Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this evening's plenary talk by Dr. Joshua Daskin. Just some housekeeping announcements before we begin. As always, there is a separate Slack channel on the Slack workspace for this particular plenary, so please do post your questions and comments for Joshua on that channel, and I will be then taking those questions and posing them to him after his talk is concluded. And yes, thank you very much for joining us. Joshua, thanks so much for making the time to be here, despite all the differences in the time zones and so on. We're very grateful to have you talk to our participants about a subject that perhaps has not received as much attention as it should, especially in South Asia and in India. And it is my great pleasure indeed to introduce Joshua Daskin, very, very interesting person who's done a lot of very, very interesting work that you will be hearing about today. Joshua did his bachelor's in biology and environmental sciences from Brandeis University, after which he did a master's in zoology from James Cook University, and then returned to the US to do his PhD at Princeton, which is a fascinating body of work. Joshua is basically looking at understanding how armed conflict has led to declines in large vertebrate populations across Africa, and specifically in Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, looking at the impacts of the Mozambican Civil War and how that has had cascading impacts on the populations of large vertebrates, and then on the ecosystem as a whole. So it's really, really interesting work. Joshua then was with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and a year ago has joined the Archbold Biological Station in Florida as their Director of Conservation, and does a lot of work, applied work with research and action protecting Florida's unique and endangered wildlife and ecosystems. So thank you again, Joshua, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Umesh. Bear with me while we get the slides up. There we are. Hopefully everyone can see that all right. So thank you very much again, Umesh, for the invitation. And it really is a pleasure to speak to this group. I think this is probably the most important group I've spoken to. So I appreciate you all giving the time and coming here. I know you are all really the future leaders of conservation in some of the most biodiverse places on Earth. So I look forward to all the work that you will do in your careers. And I hope this talk is part of a stimulating week that spurs you all to great things. So Umesh has given a great introduction, and I'm going to speak on this topic of how conservation is impacted by armed conflict. And then a little bit as well about making the case for impact-oriented science. So how do we make sure that the research we do is actually applied? And I'll just start with a little bit of an overview of where the talk will be going today so that you have a sense. As Umesh mentioned, I'm going to start with some time on a place that I know very well and that has inspired much of my own and others' interests in the overlap of conflict and conservation, and that's Gorongosa National Park, Mozambique. Then we'll zoom out a little bit and think about the ecology of conflict and wildlife in war zones across Africa. And then come back, like I said, to how do we make sure that the work we do as scientists, as researchers, really matters and has an impact. And I'll talk a little bit about some lessons I've learned from my work in Africa and from more recent work here in Florida in the southeastern United States. So without further ado, let's give you a little orientation to Gorongosa. It is this about 4,000 square kilometer blob here in the center of the country of Mozambique, which is on the southeastern coast of Africa. It's one country northeast of South Africa. And the park is the flagship national park for the country. It's situated at the southern end of Africa's Great Rift Valley, which is a long, relatively flat plain that extends along the eastern avenue of the continent. And the park has several distinct geographic features, including Lake Urema at the center, and then slopes upward out of the Rift Valley to a few different landscape types. And so just to give you a sense of the landscapes, I'll show you a few of the different habitat types that occur there. This is Lake Urema at the center of the park and its floodplain. And as you can see, just for scale, this is a pod of a couple dozen hippos, hippopotamus. So this is a really large landscape that we're talking about. Coming towards the edges of the park, as I said, sloping out of the Rift Valley is what we call the Midlands Miombo. And this is an area dominated by two genera of leguminous trees, Julbernardia and Brachystegia. And the haze in the air here is smoke. This is an area that burns frequently naturally. There's also a variety of savanna and riverine landscapes dominated by acacia, combretum, and various other trees and grasses. And then there's a disjunct section of the park that I won't speak about too much today. It's the northwest of the park proper is a montane rainforest on Mount Gorongosa with several endemic species and more that are discovered with each scientific expedition that goes up there. So some history of Gorongosa. It was founded as a national park in 1960 after decades as a hunting reserve under Portuguese colonial rule. There were upwards of maybe 6,000, usually very high-end tourists per year who would visit Gorongosa. This included some really well-known folks like John Wayne, the actor from Hollywood, astronauts, and some famous authors. And you can see this was sort of an idyllic place if you had the capacity to go and visit and enjoy things like driving your small vehicle out onto the savanna floodplain, hopefully in the dry season, and seeing Africa's large wildlife. As you may surmise, Gorongosa is home to nearly all the famous iconic African large mammals. So zebra, waterbuck, hippopotamus, lion, but it's also home to some lesser known or lesser heralded biodiversity, including many very large crocodiles, Nile monitors, vervet monkeys, and some less charismatic but equally spectacular species. Two of my favorites in the top left here. This is the African lungfish. This is the closest living relative of humans that's still aquatic, so relatively closely related to the early ancestors of tetrapods. And then this colored fish here is an African killifish, one of the shortest lived adult vertebrates in the world. It actually lives in these seasonal ponds, lays eggs that then overwinter in the dried out seasonal pond, and the adults only live a few weeks. So just some really fascinating, amazing biodiversity in this place. Unfortunately, Gorongosa is also home to a really rather tragic history in some ways. So many of you may know that there was a history of civil war in Mozambique from 1977 to 1992, which followed the War of Independence from the late 60s into the early 70s. I'm definitely not a historian, so I'm not going to dive into too much of the politics and sociology of the war, but suffice to say that sadly, over 1 million Mozambicans died, and over 1 million were displaced as refugees. During the course and after the war, Mozambique had the highest infant mortality rate in the world. 17.2% of infants died before their first year of life. As of today, the country still has the 10th lowest human development index in the world, so a measure of how well off people are living, though there is a trajectory on the upswing. The war also had some very severe impacts on the wildlife in Gorongosa. So these graphs show in the left-hand bars the population density of large herbivores before the war. So these were aerial surveys done by a scientist named Ken Tinley, an Australian fellow who was in the park from 1966 to 1972. These surveys were from the last couple of years before the Civil War. And then the right-hand bars for each species are the sort of accumulated aerial surveys immediately after the conflict. So from 1994 to 2002. And you can see that all the species here and really all the species in the park declined very sharply. Overall, there was a greater than 95% decline in the abundance of most of the species, including wildebeest, buffalo, and zebra that dominated the ecosystem before the war. Just to give you a sense of how massive this change was, I'll show you two photos. The first taken on the over the Lake Urema floodplain by Ken Tinley in 1969 before the conflict. And the second, which I took in 2012 on my first trip to Gorongosa over the same floodplain. And of course, this is just an example taken in a snapshot of time, but the top one there shows a herd of about 3,000 buffalo. And when I went in 2012, I didn't see a single buffalo. So the near complete removal of all of these large herbivores and many of the predators that historically ate them was due to poaching during and after the war, so that people could survive. They needed to eat something during the times of poverty during the conflict. And also, especially towards the end of the war, more commercial poaching, especially for elephant ivory. And the removal of all of these large herbivores, which were previously eating a large amount of plant material in the park, is not only tragic in a conservation sense, but also somewhat of an elegant, if sad, natural experiment for ecologists to study what the role of large herbivores are in a savanna ecosystem. So I'm going to talk you through two examples of how the loss of the large herbivores in Gorongosa has affected the ecosystem there. And most of the park is some form of a savanna. Savannas are characterized by a grassy understory with some amount of woody cover above it. And if you get too much grass, you have a grassland, and if you have too much trees, you'll shade out that grassy understory and you'll have a forest or something approaching it. And this is controlled by a balance of water and, water, fire, and herbivory in general. And so there's a few ways in which the large herbivores can be hypothesized to affect that balance between tree cover and grass cover. And we can break those large herbivores into two broad groups. The browsers that eat primarily woody material, so that would be things like an elephant. And they have a direct negative impact on woody cover by, like I said, eating trees, eating shrubs, and so forth, knocking them over. And then grazers like buffalo and zebra, which primarily eat grass. And so they have an indirect positive effect because they remove grass that would otherwise compete with trees. So just to review, browsers remove trees, grazers indirectly improve or increase tree cover by removing the grass that competes with it. There are some feedbacks with fire as well. If you have more grass, you're more likely to have fire, which consumes trees. But we can focus primarily on browser versus grazer for today. So we had this sort of nice theoretical setup of, all right, we've removed all or nearly all of the browsers and the grazers. Which direction will tree cover go in a savanna? And I used a series of remotely sensed aerial imagery, or satellite imagery actually, dating back to the early 1970s, using some of the very first surveillance satellite imagery from the US Central Intelligence Agency, and paired it with modern satellite imagery to measure tree cover before and after the conflict. So on the left bar here is the park-wide changes. In 1977, there was a little bit under 30% tree cover, and then right around 40% tree cover in 2012. So that would be about a 1/3 increase in tree cover. But if you then split the park into some of those habitat types that I was telling you about, so the floodplain, and then a few different types of savannas, alluvial and colluvial in particular, and that Midlands miombo that burns really frequently, you can see that the actual changes in tree cover for those areas were much larger on a proportional basis. In particular, that floodplain that was historically almost devoid of tree cover and woody vegetation had greater than a doubling of tree cover. A lot of that was actually, excuse me, an invasive shrub called Mimosa pigra, which occurs across Southern Africa and South Asia and frequently invades grassland ecosystems. And I'll come back to that briefly in a few minutes. So the overall trajectory here was increased tree cover, and we learned that, at least in Gorongosa, the browser guild, the browsing herbivores, had a stronger impact on tree cover than the grazers. For a second example, we'll come back to the animal community, actually, and look at a study done by my colleague, Justine Becker, who's now a starting faculty member at Montana State University. Together we looked at how this species of antelope, this is a bushbuck, rather small antelope, which naturally exists in thicket vegetation, similar to what you see across the bottom here. They really like to hide in dense vegetation cover to avoid predators, especially leopards, but also lions and wild dogs. And Justine had this really neat observation that after the conflict, when we were working in Gorongosa, this species, bushbuck, was sometimes seen out on the floodplain where there's no cover for it. She thought this might be because there were relatively few predators left in Gorongosa as well. So she designed this really wonderfully creative, innovative experiment combining movement tracking using GPS collars on antelope, on the bushbuck, with some playback experiments simulating the return of large carnivores. So she would play on a big speaker in the field the sounds of a leopard or sometimes a lion, and watch and see what the bushbuck that had a GPS collar on, where they moved. And so, as I said, if you don't have any predators, there were some of these individuals that were hanging out on the floodplain, which was, historically would have been an unsafe habitat. So no predators, staying on the floodplain. If, however, you simulate the presence of a large carnivore, a lot of those bushbuck would actually move back into cover. So this was pretty neat. It showed not only that there had been a shift in how these bushbuck assess risk, that they were able to take advantage of a new habitat, but that it's a plastic behavior, and that the animals that actually had really never been there, they hadn't lived long enough to have experienced high carnivore populations, have this innate behavior that they know to go and seek cover when the carnivores return. As it turned out, we also used some diet analysis to work out that the floodplain ecosystem had higher nutritional value to these bushbuck than did their natural habitat in the thickets. So these animals were actually taking advantage of the removal of carnivores to go and stock up on high nutritional forage. And in turn, the animals that were living on the floodplain were actually larger and in better body condition than those that remained in the thicket. Meanwhile, the impacts on the human community were real and lasting. I mentioned that that there were serious impacts for infant mortality, for poverty, and life expectancy at the end of the civil war in Mozambique was only around 45 years. Even today, only about 1% of households in the Gorongosa district around the park had access to electricity. There's about 200,000 people who live within about 10 or 15 kilometers of the park. So this is a large place with serious impacts, not only for wildlife, but for people. And after a few years of getting to know Gorongosa, I began to wonder, is Gorongosa unique? There are sadly many places where there have been conflicts and where poaching has happened as well. So I began reading and found that a few people had thought about this. And one very frequently cited paper is by Thor Hansen in 2009. And he lined up the locations of big, broad conflict zones with biodiversity hotspots, which are areas with particularly high plant endemism, so species that are have a very local range, and very high habitat conversion. Although these biodiversity hotspots only cover about 1/6 of the Earth's surface, over 80% of wars, those are conflicts with 1,000 fatalities of people or more, occurred in these biodiversity hotspots. So that's a pretty highly disproportionate number, and makes you sort of want to wonder, what are the impacts well beyond one park of conflict on biodiversity? So I zoomed in a little bit from Hansen's work and began mapping conflict at the scale of Africa, and not looking necessarily at the big broad biodiversity hotspots, but looking at individual protected areas. So I used an existing map, an existing GIS data set of armed conflict locations, which was put together by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Sweden, and then paired it with this map of protected areas across the continent, and just overlapped the two and said, how many years did conflict locations overlap with each protected area? And you can see that for, excuse me, for the 65 years between 1946 and 2010, conflict was quite frequent in Africa. This is not news to many folks, but the sort of coincidence of conflict with many of Africa's iconic national parks was not something that had achieved a lot of attention. Several groups have made really generally qualitative attempts to describe the effects of armed conflict on conservation. So describing all the different pathways by which war can impact wildlife and ecosystems. A really nice one comes from Caitlin Gaynor, who's now at the University of British Columbia. She and her colleagues published a paper in 2016 with this framework here. They said there are maybe 5 broad groups of ways in which wildlife and wildlife habitat and populations can be impacted by war. First is really the most direct, through military tactics. So this would be things like actually dropping bombs or shooting wildlife. Second would be supporting military activities. So this would be mobilizing militaries, building new roads, which can have all kinds of knock-on effects, from fires to poaching to actually destroying habitat. Changing institutional dynamics, that refers to the shifting priorities of either governments or nonprofit organizations during times of conflict. So you can imagine if, for instance, you're the World Wildlife Fund or the Nature Conservancy or a smaller nonprofit working in a place where a conflict breaks out, you might pull your people out of there and go invest your activities elsewhere. Equally, if you're a government and there's a conflict in your country, you might shift your financial investments towards military activities and away from conservation. Movement of people, this would be like the movement of refugees, for instance, into a national park where they may hunt, as they did in Gorongosa. And then altered economies and livelihoods. There can be things like opening of new trade routes, either between conflict zones or the closing of a trade route into a place where conflict may have occurred. And this can impact bushmeat trade, timber trade, all kinds of natural resources. So all of these kinds of qualitative assessments are really useful, but maybe not quite sufficient. As you may have gathered from my explanation just now, there actually can be both positive and negative impacts of conflict on biodiversity. So to give you a couple more zoomed in examples, Rwanda, a small country in Central Africa, and its famous national park, Akagera, during the country's genocide in 1998, refugees moved into Akagera and caused about a 90% decline in its big mammals. So very similar to Gorongosa. Next door in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's been decades of ongoing conflict and about a 98% decline in the hippopotamus population in its most famous park, Virunga National Park. There were also, excuse me, major declines in large ape populations, which were hunted for their meat as well, from the 1970s into 2000, into the mid 2000s. But I mentioned there can be positive impacts. So the most famous example of that comes from the Korean Peninsula and the Korean Demilitarized Zone. So this strip of land is about 4 kilometers wide and was established in 1953 as an area that both North and South Korea agreed not to enter with their military troops to prevent additional conflict in the future. So this area has now for almost 70 years acted as not only a peace park, but a de facto reserve for much wildlife. Species like Asiatic black bear, musk deer, spotted seal, and potentially even tigers, although that's not confirmed, use this no man's land where there are virtually no people as a wildlife sanctuary. So there is some evidence for either positive or negative directional effects. And it was, at the start of my work, not really clear which was predominant. So I set out to test this positive versus negative, again, using data from large mammalian herbivores and parks across Africa. It's convenient to work with these species because they are not only subject to impacts of conflict because of their potential value as meat, but also they're among the most frequently counted animals in the world. So many national parks and other protected areas in Africa have a long history of aerial or ground counts to keep track of mammal population densities. So I went to the literature and collected, I think it was 253 mammal population estimates from about 126 protected areas in 19 countries. And those are the protected areas that are shown here in green. So primarily from Southern and East Africa with a few in Central and West Africa. And these were populations for which there was at least 2 time points of data. So we knew a before or an early and a late at least. You can see on the left here, the species that were most common in the data set. Unsurprisingly, elephants were by far the most common, followed by buffalo, waterbuck, and a few of the other herbivores, including zebra, impala, and warthog. Elephants are probably very likely the most frequently counted animal in the world. And so I, for each of those populations, computed this statistic, which we'll call lambda. And it's pretty simple. It's just the density of the population at time 2, the later time point, divided by the density at time 1, and then scaled by the number of years between the 2 estimates. And lambda is a really convenient statistic because a lambda of 1 indicates that there's been no change in the population size. A lambda of 1.1 would indicate a 10% growth rate, and a lambda of 0.9 would indicate a 10% decrease, and so forth. So it's quite intuitive. I then paired those lambda estimates of population changes in all these large herbivore populations with that conflict data that I mentioned on the Africa-wide map. And so for each protected area in the study and each span of year 1 to year 2 for a mammal population, I computed how frequent was conflict in that park. So I've got a hypothetical example here with a protected area in blue, and then the grid cells from the conflict data set that overlap it, and say the red ones are indicating where there was conflict and the white ones indicate no conflict. So in year 1, we would have 8, in year 2, 9, and in year 3, 7 grid cells that overlap with the park. And we can say that on average, 0.73% or 73% of grid cells in the park had conflict between years 1, 2, and 3. After computing lambda and the conflict frequency for each of the 253 populations, I did a first very simple analysis where I just did a logistic regression on the probability that a population was declining. So 1 would be definitely every population is declining, and 0 would be no populations declining, versus that conflict frequency statistic. And you can see it's quite clear with greater conflict frequency, large mammalian herbivore populations in African parks are much more likely to be declining. Then got a little bit more complicated and split the data set so that we had the full data set from 1946 to 2010, and then just a more recent subset to look at the last 2 decades in the data set from 1989 to 2010. And in both cases, even when you correct for a number of covariates, including protected area size, human population density, drought frequency, which can impact large herbivores, and the relative amount of urban area surrounding a park. Conflict frequency itself still had a clear, significant negative impact on lambda. So more conflict, faster declining populations on average. So this is pretty good evidence that overall, more conflict tends to have a negative impact, at least on large herbivores. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the case for all aspects of biodiversity and ecosystems, but in this system, at least, it was quite clear. This may sound like a completely tragic outcome. War, biodiversity loss, not very happy, but there is maybe a glimmer of hope in the data. So if we look in these blue boxes, the areas where populations are declining, you'll actually see that there are maybe relatively few extinctions, which would be these few down here on the 0 line. So although these populations are declining, they're generally not going extinct. And that suggests there's maybe a large number of places where restoration is possible, where there's still some wildlife hanging on and the potential to bring them back. So that will take us back to Gorongosa. And I want to introduce you to my friend and colleague. This is Greg Carr, who's a remarkable person. Greg was fortunate enough to make a fortune in the early 1990s at the start of the tech boom, working in the internet and software industries. And he decided that he'd done enough of that and was ready for a change and a way to spend the rest of his life. And he has dedicated his activities and a large amount of his finances to restoring and recovering Gorongosa National Park's wildlife and people. So since 2006, he's been invested there and has built a real industry around Gorongosa's recovery. It started in many ways with hiring and retraining the park's wildlife guards. So these are the rangers, and they're all hired from communities directly around the park so that people have a start of a reason to rely on the park economically outside of harvesting wildlife. And to sort of cut to the chase, we'll tell you more of how this happened, but to cut to the chase, it's working. So this is a whole slew of large herbivores and one primate species down here. This is a paper that was led by Mark Stallmans, the park's lead scientist, director of scientific services in 2019. And again, you can see on the left-hand side, those are those pre-war aerial estimates that I showed earlier. Then second, the immediately post-war period from 2004 to 2012. And then the most recent period they had surveyed 2014 to 2018. And you can see that just about all populations are largely on the upswing. So Nyala, which is a medium-sized antelope, kudu, a larger one, buffalo, eland, warthog, almost across the board, things are doing quite well. And amazingly, the biomass, the total abundance of large herbivores is now approaching that before the war, though there have been some major changes in community composition. It turns out that when you restore the large herbivore community, you restore other things about the ecosystem as well. So I mentioned briefly that Mimosa pigra, the invasive plant that was that accounted for a lot of the increased woody vegetation on the floodplain. And my colleague Jen Guyton, who's now a freelance photographer and journalist focused on conservation issues, led a study on the Gorongosa floodplain, where she showed that as large herbivore biomass increased, so pre-war conflict, almost no large herbivores, and then the recovery and restoration, the abundance of that invasive plant declined sharply. So pre-war, lots of large herbivores, immediately post-war, lots of mimosa, and then actually a pretty sharp decline. And she and her colleagues, we paired community ecology surveys of the plants on the floodplain with diet analyses of the large herbivores to show that, in fact, they were eating a large amount of this Mimosa pigra. And if you fenced them out of a small area experimentally, you could confirm that, in fact, just removing the large herbivores for a year or two, you get a huge flush of mimosa. It flowers, it fruits, and so forth. So a really nice, elegant, complete study documenting the recovery of ecosystem processes herbivory and the applied impacts of this are that the park no longer had to consider things like using herbicide at a very broad scale to control this mimosa. There's been a pretty nice recovery of the predator populations as well. So a couple hundred lions in the park, and likely over 1% of the world's dog population, wild dog population now occurs in Gorongosa, which is remarkable. The first pair of leopards was also recently reintroduced to the park. When you're trying to do a large-scale socio-ecological restoration, there are many aspects to it, and it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of star power. So this is E.O. Wilson, the name I'm sure many of you will know. And this is the then ambassador of the U.S. to Mozambique, meeting the then warden of the park, Mateus Matemba, at the opening of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Lab. So the park is now home to this really first-rate field station with a DNA extraction lab, bunks for students, cabins, state-of-the-art museum collecting facility for documenting biodiversity, and is home to the first Masters in Conservation Biology program in Mozambique. So this is a fully accredited program that occurs strictly within the park and trains about a dozen Mozambicans a year in master's level conservation biology, so that Mozambicans can increasingly be able and employed in managing their own national parks. There's a whole slew of other socio and ecological restoration activities that are going on in Gorongosa. This is one of a large number of girls' clubs that provides a safe and nurturing environment for young girls around the park to meet every weekday after school to study and to learn life skills. They're given school materials like uniforms and books and pens and pencils to help facilitate their continued enrollment in school. This is obviously really important for conservation because there's very good evidence from the socio-ecological literature, from the development literature, that when you keep young women in school, they're less likely to marry early, less likely to have large numbers of children, which can be difficult to support in these still impoverished places, and which can lead to needing to rely on wildlife for income. A little bit closer to the wildlife story itself, elephants in Gorongosa have a propensity to cross the river out of the south end of the park and then invade crop fields, something that I know happens across Africa and across parts of South Asia, leading to really severe human-wildlife conflict. And again, the difficulty of local communities, very understandably, to value the presence of the park and to contribute to its conservation. So Paula Branco, who's a veterinarian and was a master's student in ecology from the University of Idaho, completed an experiment where she showed that actually using beehives that you can see her stringing up along a very rudimentary fence here can really turn the elephants back away from these communities and back across the river into the park. So pretty simple innovation, which has been tried in a few other places as well. And again, just really trying to avoid the conflict between people and the park so that folks can increasingly see the park as an economic engine from tourism, from employment as rangers or in the tourism industry, so that the ecological restoration can proceed as well. Up on the mountain section of the park, that disjunct rainforest area, there is a shade-grown coffee project restoring native vegetation growing above coffee plants, which are then roasted on site in Mozambique and then sold globally, actually. And that's a great thing because about 30% of that montane rainforest has been cleared compared to 1970. So these maps done by Mark Stallmans again show the historic loss of the green is the rainforest tree cover surrounded by some matrix of montane grasslands. You can see it's heavily fragmented. So coupling the economic benefits of coffee with shade, with the overstory shade cover of native vegetation is a really nice innovation, again, which is common around the globe in places that have the appropriate climate for coffee growing. I mentioned the Masters in Conservation Biology. There have been other educational successes in the park as well. This is Dominique Gonzalez, who is among, if not the first Mozambican woman to enter a PhD program in ecology. She's getting close to finishing now, and she manages the park's elephant research program. And this is Tonekas, who is a veterinarian trained in Mozambique. And you can see he's holding a pangolin there. He's the lead veterinarian for the park now, working in wildlife health and in research. And then this is Pedro Magura, who has risen from director of conservation to now be a serious leader in the park. There are still challenges in Gorongosa. So there is still some level of poaching, although that retrained ranger staff and expanded ranger staff has done wonders to reduce the amount of poaching that occurs there. And then there are occasional really tragic outcomes like Cyclone Idai, which hit coastal and then inland Mozambique in March of 2018. This was the strongest recorded cyclone in Southern Hemisphere history. And you can see it flooded parts of the park. This is on the Lake Urema floodplain. This building, the roof is about maybe 4 meters above the ground. So you can see this is about 3.5 meters of floodwaters. And people were stranded on their homes' roofs. The park endeavors where possible to intervene in these sorts of situations. And I know this is a little bit small, but I wanted to show why they're able to do that. Well, Gorongosa is staffed like no other national park that I know. It's got not only a conservation and a science group, but it has a large human development contingent, a sustainable development group, communications group, which means that they're deeply embedded in the community in terms of health activities, nutritional activities, training, employment, and you can just go down the list of work that's happening here. Men for equality, gender programs, peace clubs. This is not particularly normal for national parks anywhere, let alone in Southern Africa. And so this means that the park is, again, engaging people economically in order to do ecological restoration. So the vision going forward is for Gorongosa to increasingly be part of a network of protected areas that span from the park into its buffer zone and out to the east towards the coast through some areas of sustainable timber harvesting, sustainable hunting, and ultimately some marine reserves as well. So this would be a relatively large, really wildlife corridor in some ways, spanning about 400 kilometers. The story of Gorongosa is not unique, though. As we've already said, this sort of impacts of conflict has been common throughout Africa. And so I think for you all attending a conference on the conservation science, the question is really, how do we make sure that the science we do as researchers, as students, or as professionals can have an impact? So I want to consider, impacts of conflict on large herbivores, and how do we make sure that we have impact? So I think ecologists often have some luck in applying their work when they're working on deliberately applied questions. So just to return to that question about mimosa, okay, we showed that the return of large herbivores leads to a really nice applied outcome, the decline in this invasive plant. That can be sort of sometimes of a lucky outcome, I would say. Sometimes it's about picking the question correctly. Sometimes it's about being deliberate about partnering your research questions with the management needs of the place that you work. So I would say this was successful. As I mentioned, it reduced the likelihood, reduced the need of the park to apply herbicide, which would have had potential knock-on effects for the watershed, for aquatic ecosystems, and so forth. But when we sort of scale up, how do we think about what I think is much more common, where researchers are not necessarily closely collaborating with managers of an active restoration or conservation project who are hungry for data? How do we make sure that we have impact? And I want to sort of humbly tell you that I'm not sure that the Nature paper I published, for which I did over 40 interviews for newspaper, for radio, for TV around the world. Shown here, it was on the front page of one of the best known newspapers in the United States, which is pretty rare for an ecology study. I'm going to tell you I'm not sure what its impact was. And the reason I say that is that we were not paired upfront with people who were ready to implement it. So I think a major lesson for me was you may have a great science idea, you may have a great conservation science idea with hypotheses about how conservation can be changed, but if you are not partnered with the folks who are ready to implement it, which is a wholly different skill set than most scientists have, I worry that you may be working in an inefficient way. And I worry that I was as well. I want to close by telling you just a tiny bit about the work I'm doing now as an example of how to make sure your work is applied. So I'm now based right about where it says FL there, the abbreviation for the state of Florida, in southeastern United States, at a place called Archbold Biological Station. And a large amount of my work is focused on conserving this area in the 2 shades of green called the Florida Wildlife Corridor. This is an 18 million acre area. So that's about 40% of the state. And this includes lots of working lands that have value for biodiversity, so ranches and timberlands. Archbold is the primary science partner in this group of nonprofits and government agencies and private individuals who are working to conserve this really ambitious amount of area. So we do all of our science now on the corridor tightly coupled with those government agencies who can go and purchase land, or with a nonprofit that can do a conservation easement where somebody sells the rights to their properties, rights to develop their properties in return for some financial payments. As one specific example, we're partnered with the University of Florida's Water Institute to understand what are the water resources benefits from corridor conservation. So we know a lot about connectivity and wildlife, preserves their genetic integrity, preserves connections between populations, but we know relatively little about water resources and connected conserved landscapes. But in Florida, all of the government agencies, many public members of the public have huge questions about water, whether it's water supply for a growing human population, water quality for fisheries, water resources for recreation. And so we've contracted with the University of Florida to do this very applied study and then turn around and hand the results directly to conservation implementers at land trusts, like the Nature Conservancy, like Conservation Florida, at state agencies like the Florida State Parks, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, federal agency, and many others. So I would just encourage you all, when you start a research project, think about who might use it as an end user and go and talk to them and say, what do you need? And that doesn't mean you can't work on a basic science question. It just means you should do both the really good, deep thinking science, but also partner with those who can help you implement it. So I hope I've given you a lot to think about. And I'm going to close just by thanking a lot of the folks who funded and sponsored this work, in particular, Gorongosa National Park and its staff, the Gorongosa Restoration Project, National Geographic, Yale and Princeton University, and now Archbold Biological Station, and the many collaborators, especially Dr. Rob Pringle at Princeton University, Dr. Jen Guyton, and Dr. Mark Stallmans, as well as a number of field assistants. So thank you all for listening. And the very last thing I will leave you with is a favorite quote of mine that says, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go and do it, because what the world really needs is people who've come alive. This was said by Howard Thurman, who was an American civil rights leader in the 1930s. And I think it really exemplifies how a lot of students can think about their futures. What about conservation makes you excited? Is it working with people? Is it working with data? Is it something in between? Is it the field work? Is it the modeling? So I would encourage you to spend your time as students and early career professionals thinking about what really gets you excited and what you're good at, because that's where we need you to engage. So thank you very much, and I will turn it back to Umesh.
Josh, thank you so much for that fascinating talk, and very encouraging and inspiring, especially, in this age of, biodiversity declines and just general doomsday scenarios. It's really great to see something like Gorongosa happening and something like your efforts at Archbold paying off in protecting Florida's biodiversity. We've got a number of questions on the Slack channel, obviously. that people have been very, very interested with your talk. Nishant asks, says, very interesting session on human conflict and biodiversity. We asked where can we read a little more about such incidents and their impact on biodiversity? Could you share some details like books and websites, for instance? I think that question is best answered on the Slack channel. If you could just post links and titles that the participants can then explore later.
Yeah, I'll just say that I focused obviously very much on what I know best, which is the African case. There is quite a bit of work from parts of South America. The country of Colombia has seen decades of conflict, which has recently slowed. And there's some very interesting work on conflict and deforestation coming out of Colombia, as well as some other places. So yeah, I will definitely log on to the Slack channel later today, which will probably be your tomorrow morning, and share a few books and other resources for folks who want to learn more.
Thank you. Thank you, Tabu. We have another question by Samira, who again says very interesting talk. Thank you. She's curious if Gorongosa is state funded. How do they fund the very many groups and endeavors that you showed?
Yeah, great question. I did sort of gloss over that. So the philanthropist that I mentioned, Greg Carr, started the restoration financially with a commitment of his own finances to begin the restoration. As of a few years ago, I don't have the exact numbers now, but as of a few years ago, they are now leveraging some funds from the state of Mozambique, from the country of Mozambique, but especially international aid and other foundations. So the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is a US-based institute, a nonprofit focused on human well-being, has actually made Gorongosa one of its first ecological or conservation investments because of all the human well-being work that's being done around the park. Irish Aid, a few other international aid groups as well. So there's actually quite a number of funders now.
That's great. A question by Malaika, which is actually a question that I also had, but I was not going to ask, which is, what are the socio-political challenges you face as a researcher while conducting your work in Gorongosa?
Umesh, since you maybe had the question as well, can you elaborate a little bit the socio-political challenges that I faced as a researcher, like me personally?
Yes, I think that's the question. And I have an allied question here, which is, very often when people talk about conservation and working with communities to conserve, the communities are often classed and lumped as a single socio-political unit, whereas in fact, there's a lot more at play there in terms of social and political dynamics, even within the community. So I guess the question is both the challenges that you personally faced, as well as the larger challenges for conservation while working with people.
Yeah. So I guess maybe on the personal level, I would start by saying that the infrastructure for working in conflict zones as a scientist can be challenging. And I would not recommend that folks go out, try to do field work in an active conflict zone. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we know relatively little about some of the impacts of biodiversity in these places. As I mentioned, academic institutions certainly don't tend to work in these places as much as in peaceful places. Nonprofit groups and government agencies probably have less to invest in conservation in these places as well. So there are certainly some logistical challenges. When I started working there in 2012, the conflict was relatively quiet, but not non-existent. And so we did have to sort of keep an ear to the ground occasionally. But it's now quite stable in the park, at least, I would say. And then, yeah, there are definitely some bigger scale challenges about working with communities. And again, I can give the perspective that I have, which is as a biologist, not a sociologist, but I would, as I said, for trying to apply your work, the biggest thing I would say is to partner. So don't go in and assume that you know the community. Go in and find the people who do, and find the places that you can work where you help them, and where they can help you understand what's doable in the place, what you might be able to bring to that community, especially if you're not from that place. Yeah, I think that's a pretty broad answer, but I would say spend the time to get to know the people who know the place.
Yep, that's very important. Thank you for raising that. We have a number of other questions that I'm sure we're not going to have the time for, but again, thank you for your very interesting work. This is a question by Srinivasan. What are the challenges facing ecological restoration work? I suppose in the context of Gorongosa.
Okay, yeah, I'll answer in the context of Gorongosa or maybe in conflict zones more broadly. Gorongosa is perhaps unique now in that it's a former conflict zone that is rather well known and rather well funded from both the private side and the international public side. So I would say more broadly, funding is a huge limitation. We know a fair bit ecologically about what wildlife need. They need a habitat where they're not being poached, where there's appropriate resources. And that's not to say that the biological side of restoration is easy, but I think it's perhaps better understood than how to channel funding to some of these places. There is not an infinite number of philanthropists who are interested in these kinds of things to seed the projects. I don't for a second think that Irish Aid and National Geographic and Howard Hughes Medical Institute would be involved in a restoration in a Mozambican national park to the scale that they are without having had the seed funding from somebody who's interested. So that's a little bit of a downer, I would say, because it means like we do need these Greg Carrs out there who are willing to get things started. But I will also say that it doesn't have to start at the scale of a whole national park. So there are grassroots organizations throughout Africa that are working on, throughout Africa and throughout the world, who are working on restoration projects. And I would say that growing from a small amount of funding can work, though it's certainly challenging. So yeah, I would point first to funding, to be honest.
Right. An allied question, because you bring up the challenges that are associated with the restoration, which is from Madhura. Again, she says a lovely talk, and that the effect of the return of herbivory on invasive mimosa sounds very encouraging. Are there any other such examples in grasslands or other habitats that you're aware of where herbivory potentially and restoration has led to a decline in invasive species?
That's a great question. So there are some allied ecosystems that are very similar to Gorongosa's floodplain, a little bit further north in Africa. Kafue in Zambezi comes to mind, and they similarly had a decline in large herbivores followed by a recovery led by some of the same species of herbivores as in Gorongosa, primarily waterbuck. So I don't actually know if there's an invasive species story there, but I would start by looking at places with similar ecosystems. There are places, thinking about Florida here where I work, cattle are actually used to hold down some of the invasive plants in grasslands or semi-native grasslands that have been converted partially to pastures. So there's definitely an applied angle to that where some of the productive cattle ranges can also hold back some of the invasive grasses that are a problem for ecosystems and for ranchers. Whether there are other well-documented cases of wild herbivores holding back invasive plants, I would have to do a little bit of searching for that. It may well exist.
Sure. We have a question by Shubhra, who says, you cite the Korea example as a positive impact of the war, but it doesn't it depend on how you look at it? I think that she thinks that the demilitarized zone isn't under any of the impacts of war.
Yeah, that's fair. I've used this example several times, and you might say it depends on the peace, not the war. In some sense, there's a chicken and the egg question here. There would be no demilitarized zone had there not been a war. Probably it would have been developed and so forth. There are other places where this kind of no man's land effect occurs. For instance, the Zimbabwean Bush War in the 1980s, there were large swaths of the country that were considered too dangerous for people to enter, even for poachers. And the elephant population actually went through the roof. It was like one of the best places in the world for elephants at the time. I would say sort of sussing out some of the mechanistic differences between places like Zimbabwe, which was at the time Rhodesia, and the things that happened in Mozambique, where populations of elephants and other herbivores declined. That's going to require some really difficult on the ground understanding of socio-political, socio-ecological dynamics that, frankly, I didn't get to in my zoomed out continent scale study. So I do have a book chapter coming out on the sort of summary of war and wildlife and war and habitat impacts. And one thing that my co-author Rob Pringle and I highlight is the need for more data and the need for using creative ways to collect that data, whether it's remote sensing or automated cameras or acoustic monitoring or drones to work in some of these challenging places. But it is ultimately also going to require getting on the ground and talking to people who understand the socioeconomic dynamics. Why did one place see an increase when many more saw a decrease in wildlife populations?
Right. We're unfortunately running out of time. I'm sure our participants would have loved to, be here on this channel and talk a lot more. But I think we'll just take one last question, which is by Nayantara. And she asks, what are your thoughts on the ethics of positionality of researchers studying the political ecology of an internal conflict as an external party entering a sensitive political scenario, making conclusions about the situation, which might often point fingers at human parties involved? Does one need to deal with the situation with neutrality apolitically, or does one being involved also come with the responsibility to have a political voice?
Great question. Very thoughtful. Thank you for that. I would say, I have a couple of thoughts on that. Firstly, I would say to the question of pointing fingers, that's not really what I consider my role as a researcher. I would say my role is to understand the process and the patterns that we see and to supply that information to those who can do good with it, hopefully. So, I have never waded into, what were the causes of the Mozambican conflict or anything like that, which I would leave to sociologists, economists, political scientists. And then the second half of the question, I think, was give me the second half again, Umesh. Sorry.
Should you deal with the situation that you're encountering in the field? Do you deal with that apolitically, or does being involved actually come with the responsibility to raise a voice?
Yeah. So this has come up in scientific circles for years. Do scientists have a responsibility to be applied in their outcomes? Do scientists have a responsibility not to get involved in applied outcomes? And I would say I fall very strongly on the former, as stewards of information, stewards of data, stewards of methods that help us get hopefully unbiased information. It's incumbent on us to make sure that we do engage with decision makers, we do engage with communities, so that the work we're doing is not just in some bubble, it's actually having an impact. So that's exactly what I was, sort of lamenting. One of my lessons from the continent-wide work was I wish we had engaged more strongly and deliberately up front, so that there were groups ready for the outcome at the end who could say, all right, we're going to go and engage in these places, or so that we had known better up front what kinds of additional questions or additional data or analyses to do that would facilitate its application. Not to say that there was no impact, it's just a little hard to track if you don't know who's doing it.
Right. I'm really sorry that we're going to have to end this session now, because we're just about at the closing mark here. Josh, thank you so much once again for that very, very encouraging and inspiring talk. Again, I'm sure a lot of our participants are going to go back, virtually, and with a lot to think about, and a lot to think about, not only in terms of the political and social and economic landscape that conservation operates within in their own systems, but also about asking questions for the future and how those questions can be posed well, so that management can be aided as also. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Umesh. Thanks, everyone. Those are great questions. Appreciate your time.
All right, folks, that brings us to the end of day 3 of SCCS-Bengaluru 2022. And tomorrow will be the final day. We start at 10 a.m. with a plenary by Dr. Nandini Velio and her team from Amche Mole from Goa. That will be followed by student talks from 11 to 1, and then workshops. And then we will close SCCS-Bengaluru 2022 at 5 p.m. So please don't disappear before the closing ceremony. We will also be announcing the winners of the student talks and the student posters. All right. Have a good evening and see you tomorrow.